In 1948, Britain launched something no country had attempted at that scale: a health service that would treat anyone for free at the point of use, funded entirely through taxation. The National Health Service was built on a simple promise: no one would go bankrupt from getting sick, and no one would be turned away at the door. For decades, that promise held imperfectly, but recognizably, as a source of national identity, almost as strong as the monarchy or the language itself. The strain began quietly, long before anyone called it a crisis. After the 2008 financial crash, successive governments slowed the rate at which health spending grew, even as the population aged and chronic illness became more common. Demand kept rising. Funding did not rise to match it. Between 2010 and 2019, the waiting list for hospital treatment in England had already doubled, climbing from roughly 2.3 million people to 4.6 million, entirely before anyone had heard the word coronavirus. Then came the pandemic, which did not create the problem so much as detonate it. Elective surgeries were paused. Diagnostic services backed up. Staff were redeployed to intensive care units. By September 2023, the waiting list for hospital treatment in England had climbed past a record 7.7 million people, nearly double the pre-pandemic figure, and equivalent to roughly 1 in 8 people in the entire country waiting for some form of NHS treatment. Governments since have made real progress against that number, and it is worth being fair about it. Through 2025 and into 2026, the list fell for several consecutive months, dropping to around 7.01 million in March 2026, its lowest level in more than 3 years, driven by an elective reform plan that pushed hospitals to treat more patients and cut the longest waits nearly in half. But the improvement proved fragile. By May 2026, the list had climbed back up to 7.28 million, a reminder that the underlying gap between demand and capacity had not actually closed, only been temporarily outpaced. What made this waiting list different from a simple queue was what happened to the people standing in it. A knee injury left untreated for a year can progress from a routine repair into a full joint replacement. A worsening mental health condition left unaddressed for months can become a permanent barrier to holding down a job. The medical term for this is irreversible health damage, a point past which even eventual treatment cannot fully restore what was lost. For an economy, this matters enormously because the people affected are not only patients. They are workers, taxpayers, and, increasingly, a growing drain on the very system meant to support them. This is where the story stops being only about hospitals and becomes a story about the entire British economy. Starting around 2019, a new and troubling trend appeared in the labour market data: the number of working-age adults who were economically inactive, meaning not working and not looking for work because of long-term illness or disability, began rising sharply. By 2023, that figure had reached 2.8 million people, the highest number ever recorded. Unlike inactivity caused by studying or retirement, both of which the workforce eventually recovers from, long-term sickness inactivity tends to be sticky. Many of the conditions involved are exactly the kind that NHS waiting lists were failing to treat in time. By 2025, long-term sickness had become the single largest reason for economic inactivity in the country, ahead of full-time education, ahead of caregiving, ahead of retirement. The most common condition cited by this group was not a physical ailment at all. More than half reported depression, anxiety, or related mental health conditions as their primary or contributing cause. This detail matters because it complicates the easy assumption that the crisis is purely about hospital capacity. A parliamentary committee reviewing the issue in 2025 reached an uncomfortable conclusion. It found no convincing evidence that deteriorating health or NHS waiting times were the main driver of the rising benefits bill. Instead, it pointed toward the design of the welfare system itself, in which people placed on health-related benefits receive little proactive help finding work, and only a small fraction ever return to employment within 6 months. Whatever the precise mixture of causes, the fiscal consequence was unmistakable. Spending on incapacity and health-related benefits reached roughly £65.7 billion, a figure 40% higher in real terms than just over a decade earlier. Independent forecasters projected that, left on its current trajectory, health and disability benefit spending could approach £100 billion by 2030. Comparisons between benefits and wages only sharpened the political discomfort. Analysis published in 2025 found that an economically inactive claimant receiving the standard combination of universal credit, housing support, and a health-related disability payment could end up with an income thousands of pounds higher than someone earning a typical entry-level wage. A gap critics argued discouraged exactly the return to work the system was supposed to encourage. The result was a closed loop, the kind of feedback system that is far more dangerous than any single bad policy, because no one decision caused it and no one decision can fix it. Underfunded health services fail to treat people in time. Untreated people, especially those with mental health conditions, drift out of the workforce. A shrinking workforce generates less tax revenue. Reduced tax revenue leaves less money available to expand NHS capacity. And so the waiting list, instead of shrinking, has room to grow again the moment progress stalls, as it did between March and May of 2026. None of this unfolded as a single dramatic collapse that any government could point to and call a crisis on a specific date. It unfolded the way most structural economic problems do, as a slow accumulation of decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation. Slowing the growth of health spending after 2008 was, at the time, a defensible response to a global financial crisis. Redirecting NHS resources during the pandemic was, at the time, a necessary and arguably life-saving choice. Designing a welfare system that pays out reliably to people who report poor health was, at the time, an act of compassion rather than negligence. It is only in hindsight, once all these individually reasonable choices are placed side by side, that the shape of a genuine national economic problem becomes visible. By 2026, the NHS itself had grown into one of the largest employers in the world, with roughly 1.78 million staff in England alone and an annual budget approaching £179 billion, nearly double what it had been just a decade earlier. And still, the fundamental promise made in 1948 that illness would not be allowed to derail a person's life was breaking down in a new and more indirect way. Patients were not being denied care outright. They were being asked to wait long enough that, for hundreds of thousands of them, the version of their life that existed before the wait began was no longer fully recoverable on the other side of it. What Britain now faces is not simply a healthcare funding shortfall or a welfare policy debate, treated as separate problems to be solved by separate departments. It is a single, interconnected system in which a hospital waiting list, a welfare payment, and a shrinking workforce are all, in practice, the same problem viewed from three different angles. Fixing one in isolation without addressing how it feeds the others has repeatedly proven not to be enough. The waiting list falls for a few months, then rises again. The welfare bill is reformed on paper, then the underlying incentives remain largely unchanged. The country keeps spending more, while, by several key measures, receiving less capacity in return. Britain did not lose its economic footing through one dramatic failure. It lost ground gradually in the space between a hospital corridor and a benefits office, in a chain of individually rational decisions that, added together, produced a nation where illness had quietly become one of the largest line items on the national balance sheet.